Bonjour à tous.
Good morning. Good morning. So in this session, we want to try some answers to a question which is of interest to all of us for the last 2 years, ever since we heard the word COVID-19 for the first time. How could we prevent any new sanitary impact or shocks? There will be participants who will give us different views on this question, be it prevention, logistics, and of course political side as well. So we have with us Pierre-Yves GEOFFARD, member of the Cercle des Économistes, an expert in the health economy, Xiaolong, who is a poet and a novelist specialized in thrillers, Sylvie BRIAND, who is Director for Preparation and Pandemics, Epidemics Prevention in the World Health Organization, Sayyida, who is the founder of a mental health clinic in the Sultanate of Oman, with spores of sanitary and the world sanitary, and Philippe LAMOUREUX, who is the Director General of LAM, the drug industry, which is basically the union of drug industries in Europe, in France. Pierre-Yves, you have the floor. Thank you all you all for being with us today. It is indeed, well, we are, for the last 2 years now, we've been in a pandemic that was not anticipated. So there are many countries that have been surprised, especially in France and in Europe. So other countries were better prepared, possibly because they had experienced pandemics more recently, and they were able to implement structures which could be active and rapidly active in the case of new pandemics. And in Europe, we were in this direct configuration. Can you hear me, sir? This is we had very radical measures and confinement, which in the first confinement, let's remember that in economic and social terms what it meant, that is, for the first confinement, there was a drop of activities of 30%. So 30% of the GDP drop. So if it had lasted all year round, we would have been 30% of GDP over the year. So it's huge, which means less resources to be consumed, shared among all the others. Can you hear me, sir? And can you hear the translation? Yes? Okay. So it was such a drop of the GDP, of course, raises challenges, major problems. Many people can be devoid of revenues, so deprived of revenues. So in many countries, the lockdown, social restriction, economic restriction caused, drops in revenues. In France, there were many stabilization mechanisms activated, with a considerable increase of social transfers. In 2021, the state spent 380 billion euros with a high increase of social transfer expenditures, and the revenues dropped. So the 250 billion, we talk about deficit when it comes to GDP percentage, but last year, the revenues of the state were 250 billion, and the revenues and the expenditures 380 billion. So, we had to do it because we spent more money that we actually earned. So those are elements of context which state it will not be possible to do that 5 times in the next 5-10 years. So we have to get ready to brace ourselves for something different. So how can we avoid ending up in situations which could lead us to make such decisions, which are economically costly, of course, but which, in terms of health care, they're very costly as well, because hospitals and especially emergency units were, were somewhat clogged, and the last figures for France, we consider that since the beginning of the epidemics, 150,000 deaths caused by the COVID. So it's not something, it's not a minor, 600,000 deaths per year and 150,000 more caused by COVID. So if we could prevent that, would be it would help. So we should be able to avoid this cost for the health of the population and the cost for the economic and social activity. So let's look at the questions with, we'll cover the horizon, we'll talk about what happened in China, and what happened in China, and what could actually happen in the future. What happened in China was not just a health crisis, there were the social responses that fit within society which is undergoing deep changes and transformations, with stakes which are associated with the, are linked to the social stakes, but it's the changes. But, well, I think only partly, but the pandemic came from China, so we can see how this major society organize its answer and implement systems or devices to do mass monitoring. This could help us ponder what could happen in the future and possibly how could we prevent it. Then Sylvie BRIAND will talk about will give us the World Health Organization views of viewpoint. This pandemic is in a specific moment of technological evolution, quite a strong one, and the answers we can provide from in a country or one another fit within an international context that must be taken into account with coordination problematics for the various actions. Next, Sayyida by Ismail Said, who will take the floor remotely, will talk about the sanitary stakes or challenges in another domain, which is sometimes mentioned and certainly must be taken into account, the impact on mental health. Epidemics, not just the pandemics, but the social response, the organizations to react to the pandemics do have an impact on the mental health of the population. Someone is stopping me, assigning me the stop signal. I'm only at 4 minutes. Initially it was 7 minutes. Well, I'll stop then. I'll stop now, all right. And simply by conclude on Philippe LAMOUREX, who will conclude the first round of discussion back to the issue of the question of innovation, pharmaceutical innovation, which was fascinating to follow during the pandemics. It was a new virus, and rapidly we got the vaccines. This is to be reminded, quite a performance. Was it available to all? That's another problem, but we'll look into that. And how can we get ready now? How can we be ready? How can we brace for the next pandemics? And coming back to France, France produced no vaccine, by the way, unlike many other great countries. How can we come back to France? So, with no further ado, I give the floor to the moderation. Give the moderation to Sarah. I will give the floor now to Xiao. Maybe we'll start with you, sir. Can you tell us your last novel and your views on the situation of this crisis? Thank you. Remove your headphones, sir.
Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'm actually been working on a new novel, which should be coming out at the end of this year, the French version. It's titled Love and Murder in the COVID Days. Of course, it's about China. It's about China. Ironically, I've been to Wuhan just a couple of months before the outbreak of coronavirus. And I was born in Shanghai, So what happened to Shanghai this year really, changed my thinking about the disaster. What worried me is with the Omicron, for most people, of course, it's still serious, but for most people, it's like a flu, right? So the Chinese government should have come up with a different response. But no, they even push the zero out, Qingling, or lockdown further with advanced technology and turning China into a civilization society like George Orwell's 1984. And that's what really worries me. Let me give you a few examples because I can only speak from a writer's perspective. In Wuhan, a young doctor worked in a hospital. He just sent a WeChat message about something serious is spreading in the hospital. You better take better care of yourself. So he did not say anything else. But even for the website, there are numerous people called net cops. Anything, any post you placed will be immediately discovered. And he was, Dr. Li, a real person, he was summoned into the police bureau and had to sign a guilty plea and a promise, or I lied or something. So it's such a huge blow. And ironically, he fell sick with the virus himself and died shortly afterwards. The whole nation mourned him. I wrote a poem for him too. And this is, how severe the surveillance and control situation can be in China. And this certainly led to the more people get infected, right? You cover up until you cannot, and then it's too late. So Wuhan is locked down. Now, about in Shanghai, I would say things even more scary to me, at least to me. Again, I can give you some example I'm writing into my book. And it's a real example, but in my book it will be fictionalized. But Shanghai now pushed forward a COVID code. It's like they can automatically check whether they have done a test, what's the result of a test, and if you're okay, it's a green code. If not, red code. And in some cases, likely, it's a yellow code. For instance, if I come close to someone, say 10 feet, okay, if someone has a red code, then my code will also be changed. I don't know how they can do that. So it will be either red or yellow. I will also be sent to the quarantine camp. But the government calls that the companionship of the space and the time. What does that mean? It means you are followed everywhere, in the air, on the land, no escape. I think I just give two more examples here. One is a Shanghai woman, a pregnant woman. Her water broke out earlier than expected. But according to the Shanghai policy, you must have a test done within the last 48 hours. Otherwise, you cannot be admitted into any hospital. So her husband drove her round and around after maybe 4 or 5 hospitals. She suffered a miscarriage on the road. And another thing, it's even more scary to me. It's, you know, we are talking about healthcare system, right? And this kind of code, well, it might be controversy if you use that, right? It still can be discussed. But in China, this kind of code system is used for politics. You know, for the Chinese government, the most important thing is social stability or political stability. So not too long ago, some banks in Henan province, they are facing bankruptcy. And the people in other provinces won't go to the banks to get their money back. But the funny thing is, the moment they step into Henan province and their code changed automatically to green. So it's used or abused, you know, the healthcare for political reasons. You know,
Désolée de vous interrompre. Le dernier mot.
Sorry, last word, then we come back to you. But you have to conclude, sir. Sorry. Thank you. Merci. Thank you for the perspective, which is a testimony as well, which question us about those answers to the. We'll come back to this, sir, but let's move on to Sylvie. You are the heart of this problematics of prevention for quite a while now. You've been there for quite a while, so good morning. I would like to thank the Cercle des Économistes for this very kind invitation to talk about a healthcare issue or health issue. I think the topic is to prevent future health shocks or impacts. It is important indeed to ask ourselves the question of how we can prevent some shocks. I don't believe that we could really fully prevent. There will be new pandemics, there will be new epidemics. Why? Because, in fact, before, in the past, epidemics were localized, but now with the transportation means and human mobility globally, you know, viruses propagate much faster. When humans move, viruses travel. When humans travel, viruses travel. As long as we will travel, there will be pandemics, epidemics, and there is nothing we can do about it. But ever, you know, man has always tried to travel faster and further, and this will not change in the future. Sorry, but what we can try to do is to, even if we still face pandemics or epidemics, we want to make sure that they do not become shocks or crises as the one we experienced with the COVID. We've seen in the history there is a strong correlation between the advent of new transportation means and epidemics. Cholera, for example, cholera started spreading throughout the world in terms as a pandemic when steamships started navigating. The bacteria was able to cross the ocean, where in the past that was not possible. Well, it was not possible, and it was stopped by the duration of the transport. We must take this into consideration. The higher the improvements or the progress, the higher the risk of pandemics and epidemics. But I think we can prevent, it is possible to prevent the negative impact of such events by getting ready for it, by bracing for it. This was the disaster we witnessed with COVID. First, we were not ready. Many countries were actually not prepared at all to experience this type of events. Second, we are right in undergoing a technological revolution such that, in fact, our societies try to adapt themselves to these new technologies at the same time that they try to face a financial crisis. So in the future, if we want to prevent such shocks, we not only do we need to get ready, but we must integrate within our preparation the new technologies which provide huge potentials. We can fight better against pandemics with the tools we have now versus what we had in the last century or before. But at the same time, we must use the tools properly. And the tools are often double-edged blades, so we must know how to use them. With three examples of tools or leads to better prevent future health or sanitary impacts. First, monitoring. Now we have the possibility to do genetic sequencing, so we can analyze the genomes of the viruses, and that's why we know there are several variants. We know that there won't be BA1, BA2, 3, 4, 5, that this data information that we would never had 10 years ago, in real time, that is. And this is key information, because then we are able to adapt vaccines, treatments, as a function of viruses that circulate. The problem we face now, and this is what we will need to improve in the future, is that there is always a close link, a weak link between the scientific data and this knowledge of what is going on and the political decisions. We haven't found yet the link so that the data and information can be translated into healthcare policies that would be sufficiently nuanced and sufficiently agile to respond to the sanitary crisis. Second example is all the transformation in our information systems. I mean, we live in a new information ecosystem. Everybody's connected as far as smartphones. 58% of the global population is connected to the internet. So together with the social network, we're permanently exchanging information. So this is highly positive, of course, during epidemics, because we can inform everybody in real time and rapidly. The problem we've seen during this pandemics, the COVID, what we call the infodemia, that is basically an overload of information. That is, people don't know where to look and who to believe. And as we often said, too much information kills information. And basically, we don't know where to look, who to believe. And contradictory information increases anxiety and does not make it possible for people to make the proper decision for their own health, because they don't know who to believe. And we've seen during the epidemics and pandemics, we've seen the advent of, in addition to new variants, of new experts who have quite clear-cut opinions on the question, but which sometimes may make the communication process or about the measures somewhat blurry or confusing. So clearly we need to integrate this factor in our preparation, simply because infodemia had major impacts on the health of people, because people probably could have made decisions or adopted behaviors which were not in favor of their own health, helping them. But it did increase mistrust vis-à-vis institutions, mistrust vis-à-vis healthcare authority, mistrust vis-à-vis science. So this mistrust, this lack of confidence is something we're going to pay dearly for many years to come. We saw as well that this mistrust of rejection has increased the gaps in our society. They were pro-mask, anti-mask, pro-vaccine, anti-vaccine. So social separations or ruptures which pre-existed the pandemics got even more severe. And we talked about social link and the cohesion of our societies. Most important to take that into account when we get ready for the next pandemics. Third point, and I think I have to rush, the third point are all the technological innovations, vaccine and so on and so forth. And this is most important, and we all very happy about the improvements that make it possible to to protect, because if we are to compare mortality rate during the pandemics of 1918, the Spanish flu and the pandemics, we saved more lives thanks to the treatment, the vaccines, and the progress achieved by medicine in 1 century. So it is most important. Such scientific improvements are very important, but at the same time, we can see that where we did not progress was basically on how research on acceptance of new measures, the way populations can better react to health crisis or sanitary crisis. So we need to reinforce research in social science on the impact of sanitary crisis on society and the economy to better anticipate the impacts and prevent them in the future. Thank you very much, Sylvie. Most interesting, we talk about prevention, but we want to have also the historic background. Sayyida, we're moving to you. This crisis was and it was also showed problems with mental health, and where we were all locked down. So how should the world get ready for the next crisis, for the next pandemics? How should we get ready for this?
Hey, bonjour tout le monde. It's very nice to be here. Thank you so much for this invitation. I hope you're all doing well. I think we have to think that this was a wake-up call, a very important wake-up call. And what we have to focus more is on a humanitarian response. I agree fully with Sylvia. We cannot prevent it, but we can maybe do quicker solutions than before. We are humans, we're evolving. It's the same thing with the mind. Every day the human mind evolves and changes. We're not okay, as we heard, until we are all okay. Until today, we are still not at the right point that it's not about who was wrong and where did it come from. It's about caring, and that's what we didn't do. We thought it was far, it's not going to come to us. We didn't do any quick response because we thought it's nothing to do with us. Let's go on with our life. But things happened differently. To prevent it, again, I say we cannot do that. However, there are so many points we can make this a quicker response. We hear a lot about fear, about panic, and fear and panic are the biggest weapons of all. You can, even when people had COVID, the fear and the panic is what made them become worse. And it's interesting that mental health has been talked about all these years. There's always that silver lining, right, in everything. At least now, again, we remind people, look how important it is. It took a whole pandemic for people to realize the importance of mental health. People need to work together. We need a crisis team that means, first of all, mental health, the government, politicians, educators, all of us need to work together. It's very important, and this is what we keep on seeing, that we are only okay when we do that. Creating leaders that are more resilient, that think, okay, this is not working, we can change it. It's okay if I was wrong. This is more important now than if I'm wrong or right. It's more about change, and making change, we always say, is better. These leaders need to be created from now. In schools, we need to educate about mental health. We saw how our education system went through such a trauma with our kids and how they went through all the stress. And we think now, as we know, humans are the quickest species to adapt, but there is PTSD that's happening to us. There are things that are going to evolve with time. Collecting data, collecting information. We have to keep on doing that, working on our public health, and always infusing mental health in all of these things. You are not okay if your mental health is not okay. We cannot pull out of things if we're not. When I hear people talk about COVID and what it's gone to, it doesn't matter if they're educators or politicians or work in the government. My head always goes to your health, your mental health state. How are you feeling? Is it stressing you? Is it fear? Can you not focus in what you can do? And having a well-being is something we need to focus, and all of us, I think, can agree that we have gone through some kind of trauma. We are still going through it. Even though now we are told that things are much better, you can go and come and travel, but the fear is still there, and we have to address it. We cannot sweep it under the carpet. We cannot do that. That is something we have to really acknowledge. We have to work on it. So when there is another pandemic or when something else happens, which it will happen because we are humans, we travel, we move from here to there, we relate to each other, we talk to each other, it's going to happen, but we want quick response. We cannot prevent it completely, but we want something fast. We want something where, okay, now it's happening, let's create, where is that team, where is that crisis team, come in, what shall we do? Even when we heard about the Spanish flu, we only heard about it more, I'm talking about myself. Now, it should be something that we needed to be educated about from before. This now needs to be educated for years and years to come. It needs to be there. And the most important thing, again, is to think it's not just you. This pandemic has taught us that we are all in it together, from all around the world. It doesn't matter if you're from the West, from the South, from Asia, from the Arab states, we are all in this crisis together. And the biggest thing is because it's unknown. And when humans are not sure about something and it's unknown, that creates mayhem, that creates chaos, that creates fear, that creates miscommunication. As we've heard, social media has given us so much fear, so much miscommunication, and people kept on listening to it and denying things that we needed to do. We needed to look after ourselves. The mask is important. Things are important. And up till today, of course, we have more than one person saying that I don't think it's important. It is not real. This was all imagination. So these are things that we need to educate ourselves with. And mental health is on the top of all of these topics that we'll be talking about every day in every conference.
Merci beaucoup, Sayyida. Et enfin, on va passer à Philippe.
Thank you very much. Well, we'll come to Philippe now, and I'll come to the question that we've all asked ourselves, medical innovation. We've all become experts during this pandemic. Yes, experts in vaccines and variants. Well, I wanted to add to what Sylvie explained very clearly by way of introduction. Well, first element, after all, we are in Aix-en-Provence, so let me give you a few figures since this is an economic conference. We developed these new vaccines in over a 1-year period. This is unprecedented. It usually takes 10 to 12 years to develop a new drug. This is a technological feat. And it's been made possible by the good cooperation between industrialists, the industry, and the health authorities. Second element, before this wave of COVID, the world capacity for vaccine development was 4 billion doses. In a matter of months, we went up to a capacity of production of 24 billion doses. It's been multiplied 6-fold for one pathology. And some producers in India are stopping production of vaccines because we are in overproduction. So the issue is no longer a production issue, it's an issue of redistribution, of sharing of vaccine campaigns. This really, the real issue was never production. The first wave cost the health insurance in 2021 a bit less than 6 billion euros in France. A week of lockdown costs between 16 billion and 24 billion euros for the French economy. So I think the industry stepped up to the plate. I tend to say that, and Sylvie won't be cross at me, epidemiologists are very good at explaining how a disaster that they were incapable of predicting will not happen again. So, we are always very good the second time. But we have to constantly be in a position where we can imagine the unimaginable. It's a real challenge for health authorities, and there's a real threat. There are many threats, and we don't know which is going to translate into a world pandemic. Well, having said that, this can be nuanced, but I'll come back to this nuance in my conclusion. Let me focus on Europe and on France. First lesson learned is that everybody's realized what we've been saying for the last 10 years is that Europe is losing its strategic autonomy. We've become very dependent on the southeast of Asia for raw material, and we're dependent on the US for technological innovation. So there's a real challenge which is to make it possible for Europe and France to recover their health autonomy. I hate talking about sovereignty because I think it's a misnomer. What's at stake is to be able to reshore without deglobalizing. That's the first lesson we need to learn. Second lesson we can learn, what are the models that have proven to be successful? Well, the UK with the cooperation between Oxford and AstraZeneca, Germany with BioNTech. This single biotech generated 1.5% of GDP growth for Germany. This is food for thought, isn't it? Third example, Bioderma. Bioderma had never put a single drug on the market. So Pfizer, GSK, Sanofi are the main vaccine producers, but actually innovation went not in the direction of these major groups, but also innovation was made possible by biotechs. Is our model not too much in silos? Our research model, in which academic research and industrial research do not cooperate enough, we have a great network of biotechs, but they're too small and they're undercapitalized. Should we not give it some thought and get our ecosystem of R&D to really develop? And our health authorities have been very responsive in terms of authorizations, but France is a complex country. And we prided ourselves on having the greatest number of clinical trials, but we probably did it in a pretty scattered and not very strategized way. So I think there's also work to be done in that regard. And last point I wanted to make, the latest signs that were sent in terms of intellectual property were very counterproductive. With the new variants, I'm not sure that launching an attack against patents was the really best way to go. Everybody's looking at vaccines, everybody's looking at virus. So the next crisis will probably be resistance to antibiotics. We've known that problem for decades. We've consumed 4 generations of antibiotics in 1 generation of human beings. And research is at a stalemate. Why? Because the industry doesn't really invest a lot into antibiotics, because they know that if they find a new generation of antibiotics, there's no market for it. The health authorities will ban their marketization because they know that there's a problem of antibiotic resistance. So we need to find private partners, and this will be a major challenge for the years to come. Thank you very much for this. But your conclusion was a bit dark, a bit worrisome. But I don't know if we have questions in the audience. I have a few questions on my iPad, and then we'll give the floor to the audience. I'm sure you expected that. What should we think of monkeypox? And I'll add a question. Have we really learned anything if we're to be faced with a new emerging crisis? So maybe Sylvie first, and then we'll listen to all of you. Well, monkeypox is clearly an emergence that we've observed for decades, because we've first heard about it in the 70s in Asia and Africa. It had stayed in its niche, its environmental niche, as we call it. It is a zoonosis. And so first, of course, it was linked to traveling. It was travelers that actually caused the virus to appear, and then there were other factors that made transmission easy. We eradicated smallpox in 1978, so majority of the world population was immunized against pox viruses, same family of viruses, but from one generation to the next, we have fewer and fewer people who are immunized. So roughly speaking, people under 50 around the world are not familiar with that family of virus and are not immunized, which means that we have a pool, a potential pool of people that are at risk. So what we're striving to do at the moment is to mitigate the transmission of that virus, because for the time being, it spreads amongst young men that are pretty healthy. But what if it starts spreading amongst pregnant women, children? How will the virus behave? Pierre-Yves, you wanted to say something? Yes, I wanted to add food for thought. During that COVID-19 pandemic, we reminded everybody that one of the essential tools of public health in the phase of emergence, when there are few cases, there's a strategy that can be very efficient, which is to screen widely enough to detect all new cases, isolate people so that they can't transmit it to others, and trace people that might have been in contact with these people. We know it works, but it works only when there are a limited number of cases so that they can be traced. Currently, we are completely incapable of tracing all people that have been in contact with COVID. We've all been in contact with COVID in this room, that's for sure. About monkeypox, we would be in capacity in this phase of the pandemic to trace. Is there tracing going on? No, none. It could have been done, it could still be done. It will probably not be done. So we could legitimately ask ourselves the question, have we learned anything? Not from what happened 50 years ago or 200 years ago, but what happened less than 2 years ago. We are making the same mistakes. So we haven't learned. Right, we'll take a question from one of the contact cases in the room, gentleman with the blue T-shirt. Thank you very much. I have two questions. First, about the endogenous character. We talked about antibiotic resistance. We talked about several crises. They're often linked to human activities, transport, the melting of permafrost, zoonosis, areas of resistance. So what room for endogenization of these problems, and what thought is being given to prevention to avoid these, to prevent these diseases from emerging and creating a new shock? And my second question is, we'll have to be reconciled with a small number of actors that are going to have more and more sophisticated technology. So actually, the response will come from a limited number of players, of stakeholders, growingly limited. Philippe, did you want to tackle that idea of concentration? Yes. Well, just one word about your first comment. It is the question we asked about the monkeypox. Things are often more complicated than they might seem. I was in charge of prevention in a past career, and we set up the first campaign of respiratory virus. And we really conducted a number of studies on how to communicate, because we do not have the Chinese culture or the Japanese culture of face mask wearing, is that people would be convinced to put a face mask on to protect their children. If you can't leverage that, you lose your main, the main thrust in your communication. Second point I wanted to make, when we look at what happened with COVID and compare it to what happened with HIV/AIDS, 30 years ago, well, 30 years ago, there was a quasi-monopoly. One company or two had the treatments. With the viruses, it was the opposite. There was a full globalization of research. There were Chinese vaccines, there were Russian vaccines, there were Indian vaccines, there were European vaccines, and it's really world research that developed. And the question you asked is very important. And I'll come back to patents. The main incentive, if we want to fight more efficiently pandemics to come, is competition. The first to come up with vaccines are incentivized through patents. So there's an intensification of competition because 30 years ago, you had 4 big pharmaceutical companies. Now there are 20. Nobody talked of Israel, Ireland, Singapore 30 years ago. So it's the opposite. It's actually more of a positive element. Thank you very much. We'll take another question in the room. Yes, hello. Thank you. I have a quick question about the role of digital technology in prevention. We've talked a lot about problem solving thanks to vaccines, but one of the main gains that we've seen in prevention has been made possible by digital technology. You haven't talked about this. I'm a bit surprised. Thanks to digital technology, we can have screening tools. Well, that's, a first level screening tool. So we're going to ask the same question to 1 million, 10 million patients. And it's a machine that can actually do that in an automated manner and doesn't have to be a primary health practitioner. So how could we actually encourage Santé Publique France, the French health authorities, to take that step and use digital technology more? Because there is a reluctance. Well, it'd be interesting to hear also about digital technology for mental health, but we'll first listen to Sylvie. Well, when I talked about surveillance, it really requires a whole array of technologies. There is a deficit in the combination of these different technologies and the health authorities that should be promoting all these digital technologies. So maybe it'll take a bit more time. What we try to do is encourage our member states to rethink their preparation plans for pandemics, factoring in digital technology in their preparedness plans, and diversify tools that they had before. The problem we currently have is that we keep trying to fight pandemics the way we did it in the 20th or 19th century. We haven't digitized our response to pandemics. And I think building on our experience with COVID, we should take that next step and work all together on this. Well, let me try and complement what Sylvie said. You saw that between the WHO and the pharmaceutical industry, there could be more of a strategic fit. I would complement with an economic perspective. We are faced with an emerging market and we need to make it viable. In reality, in the pharmaceutical industry, when you associate a treatment with a digital part, payers cannot make that association viable. How can we assess these technological solutions of the future? We are moving from drugs to a holistic health solution that includes digital technology. So we have to really make the most of these digital technology tools. I'm talking about developed countries, probably not the same in developing countries. Well, just to pick up on what you said about this being the next challenge, who should rise up to the challenge? Does it have to be the states? Does it have to be the WHO? Who can shake things up? Well, WHO has a role to play. There are 194 member states that we advise. So when we issue technical guides, it is our responsibility to include these technical guides, the potential tools that they could use. But then it's up to each member state to include it in their strategy or not. It's up to each member state because it depends on the local context. But I am optimistic with regards to these new digital technologies. I think telemedicine will be a great plus in terms of access to healthcare. We've seen that there were technological leaps. A lot of developing countries use their smartphones, never use landline. They, to develop telecommunications, some countries have actually gone straight to mobile phones and never used landline when they didn't have telephone before. But to that end, we need to operate a paradigm shift. When we talk about primary health care, and it reminds me of Alma Ata, 1978, seems a bit obsolete, doing it on a shoestring to take care for people. I think primary healthcare in the 21st century has to be modern. We need to bring healthcare and services to the patients, even if they're in remote areas. This is how we will really make decisive gains. Is there time for a couple of questions, maybe? Thank you. Jean-Jacques Lambroso, I'm a journalist here and also in Africa. Well, in Africa, indeed, madam, they have all the systems on their mobile phones to pay at the till, to get money transferred to them, and they've used their mobile phones to do that for years. I wanted to say that I'm surprised, and I've been surprised over the last 3 days, to see that there's so very few people who came to this panel discussion. It's just a comment I wanted to make, because I'm surprised if people didn't come in larger numbers. Question for Mr. Lamoureux. How could we explain the current image that pharmaceutical companies have? You talked of the risk of too much lawmaking because it might hinder research. If we look at the share of public financing that has here in France or in the US that has gone to pharmaceutical companies, how do you explain that they have such a bad corporate image, bad public image? When there's been so much investment in these pharmaceutical companies, and there's also the matter of generating profit on stock markets. Well, comment off microphone. What I'm saying, sir, is that we've conducted studies on the public image of pharmaceutical companies, and there's been a really significant impact on that sector linked to COVID-19 pandemic, because the fact that we responded so fast to this pandemic has completely changed our public image. You know, a number of economic sectors have a bad public image, but something changed there. And second element, when you look at the studies on public image, there's a disconnect, a pretty strong disconnect between the image of products that is fairly positive and the public image of companies that is not so good. And we know why. We're talking about the private sector. We're talking about a very important common good, which is health. And there are profit margins that are real, not everywhere, not for on all model, but it is profit that is going to drive innovation, that is going to incentivize innovation. And focusing on France, since your question is about France, 12 years ago, drugs represented 14%, and now it's 11%, which means that there's been very little growth. If we look at all the new technological advances, new cancer treatments, we've had to really make room to make for more innovation. And we have actually both products that are out of stock and longer lead times. We've decapitalized the pharmaceutical sector by 6 billion over 12 years. I apologize, we'll have to wrap up. I would have loved taking more questions. I had more questions, but we've been fortunate enough to have really very interesting insights. We unfortunately didn't have time to come back on China, which is a lot of food for thought when we talk about preventing a next pandemic. But please feel free to go to our speakers if you want to find out more, and many thanks, panelists.